February 14th, 2022, Valentine's Day, though no one at Lake Frostvale would ever call it that. The ice was breaking up early that year. Unseasonably warm air had rolled through the Adirondacks, softening the edges of a winter that had already overstayed its welcome. For Gary Muldoon, a third-generation ice fisherman whose family had lived within earshot of the lake since the 1920s, this thaw was more than just a shift in weather. It was a rhythm he knew in his bones. He'd spent most of February out on the ice before dawn, auguring holes near the old drop-off where lake trout liked to linger in the cold. But on this particular morning, something was different. He'd set up his usual spread, 3 tip-ups spaced along a line he'd memorized after decades of repetition, when the first crack came. Not the usual groan and pop of stressed ice adjusting to temperature, but a sharp, resonant snap that seemed to travel through the water itself. Gary paused, his breath fogging in the still air, listening. That's when he heard it. Faint at first, like radio static caught between stations, then clearer, children's voices. Not shouting, not crying, just counting. 8, 9, 10. In overlapping tones, some higher, some deeper, all strangely synchronized, as if reciting from a shared script. He thought it was his mind playing tricks. Grief does that. His younger brother had been one of the counselors back in '87, gone with the rest when the storm hit. Gary never talked about it much, but he came out here every winter, every thaw, like a silent penance. Still, this wasn't memory. He fumbled his handheld digital recorder from his coat, habit more than hope, and held it toward the nearest fissure. The device captured 47 seconds of audio before the ice shifted again, and the voices dissolved into white noise. Later that day, in his pickup truck parked at the edge of the access road, he played it back, and replayed it again. The cadence was unmistakable, young voices, calm, methodical, counting from 7 to 13, then looping back to 8, over and over like a skipping record. He sent the file to a friend, a retired audio engineer from Albany who ran spectral analysis just for old time's sake. What came back startled them both, 13 distinct vocal signatures, all within the age range of 10 to 16. No electronic distortion, no evidence of layering or splicing. The frequencies were consistent with sound traveling through ice, a known phenomenon called cryosismology, where pressure waves in freezing water can carry and preserve acoustic energy under specific conditions. But not like this. Not this clearly. Not this coherently. The engineer forwarded the findings anonymously to a small investigative podcast that had been quietly digging into Cold War-era youth programs in upstate New York. Within a week, the recording went semi-viral among true crime forums. Skeptics called it pareidolia, the brain's tendency to hear patterns in randomness. The New York State Department of Environmental Conservation issued a terse statement. Natural ice fracturing can produce a wide range of acoustic phenomena. There is no scientific basis for attributing human voices to these events. But the official stance ignored one glaring contradiction. According to the 1987 incident report filed by the Franklin County Sheriff's Office, Lake Frostvale had been encased in a solid, unbroken sheet of ice for 6 full weeks following the storm of February 12. Search teams used snowmobiles to crisscross the surface. Helicopters circled for days. If the ice was that stable, if it could support heavy machinery and repeated foot traffic for weeks, then it shouldn't have fractured under natural stress in a way that would produce resonant vocal imprints decades later. More importantly, if the 13 campers had fallen through during a blizzard, as the report claimed, their bodies would have been trapped in the ice or sunk to the lakebed. Yet not a single item of clothing, not a boot, not a single bone was ever recovered. Gary didn't care about the debates online. He'd heard them. He knew what he heard. And now, every time the ice cracked near the western cove, the same cove where Camp Frostvale's dock used to extend into the water, he swore he could make out a whisper beneath the sound. "Find us." The lake, it seemed, hadn't forgotten, and it wasn't done speaking. 35 winters had passed since that night, but for Daniel Reeves, Time hadn't moved on so much as it had frozen in place, like the lake itself, locked beneath a surface that looked solid but hid something shifting underneath. He lived now in a modest ranger's cabin 10 miles west of Lake Frostvale, tucked into a pine-thick hollow where the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, and the only regular visitors were deer and the occasional lost hiker. At 51, Daniel moved with the quiet precision of someone who'd spent decades listening more than speaking. His hands were rough from splitting wood and patching roof shingles, but his eyes, pale blue, almost colorless in certain light, still held the startled clarity of a boy who'd watched his world vanish in a single night. He hadn't wanted to talk, not to journalists, not to podcasters, not even to the handful of surviving family members who tracked him down over the years, hoping for closure he didn't possess. But something about the audio file, the children counting beneath the ice, had pierced the wall he'd built so carefully, brick by brick, silence by silence. When the investigator arrived at his door on a gray afternoon in late March, boots muddy from the thawing trail, Daniel didn't slam it shut. He just stood there for a long moment, as if weighing whether opening it would let something out or let something in. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar smoke and old paper. A wood stove glowed in the corner, and on the table sat a coffee mug with a hairline crack running through the words, Camp Frostvale, Counselor Staff 1986. Daniel poured 2 cups without asking. Then, from a steel lockbox beneath his bed, a box that hadn't been opened in over a decade, he retrieved a journal bound in faded green canvas. The cover was water-stained, the spine held together with electrical tape. "I was 16, he said, voice low, almost apologetic. "I didn't know what I was writing down, I just knew I couldn't forget." The pages inside were a mess of ink smudges, hurried sketches, and sentences that trailed off mid-thought. February 10, 1987. "Margaret says the storm's coming early, told us to prep the emergency kits, but she's nervous, kept checking the radio like she's expecting a call." February 11, "Kids are jittery, said they heard singing in the woods last night, not birds, not wind, actual singing, like a lullaby but backwards." And then the final entry dated February 12, 21:30, "Power's out, wind screaming like it's got teeth. Margaret just came in eyes wide. Said the road's blocked. Phone's dead. She's sending everyone across the ice. It's the only way," she kept saying. "But the ice, it's wrong. It's too smooth. No snow on it, like it was wiped clean. I told her I'd go ahead, radio from the ranger station on the other side. She hugged me tight like she knew, said, 'Don't look back, Danny, no matter what you hear.'" He hadn't looked back. He'd run through the storm, branches tearing at his coat, heart hammering against his ribs. By the time he reached the ranger outpost 3 miles west, the radio was dead, not just out of range, dead, as if someone had cut the lines. He waited for hours in the dark, listening to the storm howl, expecting headlights, voices, anything. None came. The next morning, search teams found the camp empty. Bunks made, stoves cold, boots lined up neatly by cabin doors. But on the lake's edge, they found footprints, 13 sets, leading out onto the ice and stopping abruptly, as if the group had simply stepped off the edge of the world. For years, Daniel believed they'd fallen through, that the ice had betrayed them. But his journal told a different story, one he'd buried because it sounded insane. On the night of the storm, he'd glanced back once, just once, before the trees swallowed the view, and in the moonlight he swore the ice wasn't black. It was glowing faintly, a pale blue shimmer like the surface of a film negative. And from it rose a sound, not wind, not cracking, but a low harmonic hum, pulsing in time with his own breath. "They weren't running from the storm," he said now, fingers tracing the edge of the journal. "They were following something, or someone was leading them." He paused, then added, so quietly the words barely disturbed the air, "I should have stayed. I should have gone with them." He handed over the journal, not as evidence, but as a confession. And in that gesture, the real investigation began, not with documents or data, but with guilt that had aged like old wood, splintered, warped, but still holding the shape of the boy who'd been left behind. The road to Camp Frostvale hadn't been plowed in over 2 decades. What remained of it was a ghost of gravel and frost-heaved asphalt, swallowed in places by brambles and young birch saplings that leaned toward the light like curious children. The investigators' boots crunched through a brittle crust of snow as they stepped past the rusted metal archway that still bore the camp's name in peeling white letters, Frostvale, though the T hung by a single bolt, swaying slightly in the wind like a loose tooth. It was late March, that deceptive stretch of the Adirondack winter when the sun feels warm but the ground stays frozen, and the air carries the damp, metallic scent of thawing earth and old decay. The camp itself sprawled across a gentle slope leading down to the lake, a cluster of low-slung cabins with sagging roofs and shattered windows. Most had been ransacked long ago, by curious teenagers, scavengers, or time itself. But Cabin 3, the old counselor's quarters, still held its secrets behind a warped door that groaned when pushed open. Inside, the silence was absolute, thick with the smell of mildew and mouse droppings. Bunks lined the walls, their mattresses collapsed into nests of springs and foam, and on one, a stuffed raccoon lay on its side, one glass eye missing, the other reflecting the pale light from a crack in the ceiling. A merit badge sash, mostly moth-eaten, draped over a chair like a discarded skin. But it was the infirmary that held the anomaly. Tucked behind the mess hall, its white-painted door still bore a red cross, though the paint was blistered and peeling. The air inside was colder than outside, as if the room resisted the thaw. A metal examination table stood in the center, its surface streaked with rust, and beside it a cabinet with glass front drawers. Most were empty, but the bottom drawer stuck, frozen shut perhaps, or deliberately jammed. It took a firm tug and the splintering of aged wood to open it. Inside, nothing but dust and a single roll of gauze, brittle as parchment. But as the investigator knelt, brushing debris from the floorboards, their fingers caught on a loose plank near the back wall. Beneath it lay the camp's emergency radio logbook, a thick ledger bound in oilcloth, its pages yellowed and stiff. The final entry stopped abruptly on February 10, 1987. The last line, written in Margaret Loomis's neat cursive, read, "Storm advisory received, prepping evacuation route across lake per protocol Frost." But the following pages, February 11 and 12, were torn out. Only ragged edges remained, yet something about the paper beneath caught the light strangely. Holding the book at an angle, the investigator saw it. An ink stain had bled through from the missing page onto the otherwise blank sheet for February 13. The ghost of writing pressed hard in haste. Time, 21:43, and beneath it 3 words smudged but legible, "Not alone." The phrase hung in the air like a breath held too long. Not alone with the storm, not alone with the cold, not alone on the ice. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutters of the mess hall. The investigator stepped back out into the weak afternoon sun, logbook tucked underarm, and walked down the slope toward the lake. The ice was retreating now, pulling back from the shore in jagged black teeth, revealing the skeletal remains of Frostvale's old wooden dock, half submerged, half collapsed. Kneeling at the water's edge, they ran a gloved hand over a patch of frozen slush that hadn't melted with the rest. And there, pressed into the ice like a fossil, was the unmistakable outline of a child's hand, 5 fingers splayed, palm down, as if someone had braced themselves before vanishing. The print was perfectly preserved, encased in a lens of clear ice no thicker than a pane of glass. It hadn't been made days ago. It hadn't been made weeks ago. The positioning, the depth, the lack of distortion, it matched no known pattern of natural formation. Someone had pressed that hand into slush on a night when the temperature hovered just above freezing. On a night when 13 children walked onto the lake and never walked off. The official story said they'd panicked, that they'd broken through thin ice during a whiteout. But this handprint, calm, deliberate, preserved, spoke of something else entirely. Of stillness, of waiting, of a moment frozen not by accident but by design. And as the sun dipped behind the pines, casting long shadows across the camp, the ice on the lake gave a low, mournful groan, like a door opening deep underwater. The thermos was tucked behind a stack of collapsed shelving in the camp's old supply shed. A battered stainless steel cylinder, dented at the base, its red paint flaked away to reveal decades of rust underneath. It shouldn't have survived. The shed had long since surrendered to rot. Roof caved in, floorboards softened by years of snowmelt, mice nesting in what remained of the canvas tarps and rope coils. Yet there it sat, upright in a dry corner, as if someone had placed it there with care, knowing it would be found only when the time was right. Inside, nestled in a coil of oiled cloth, was a microcassette. Not the kind used for dictation or music, but the compact, military-grade variety, rare by 1987 but still issued to federal observers and field researchers for secure audio logging. The label, written in faded blue ink, read simply, Frostvale, Feb 12. No name, no department, just a date that had become synonymous with silence. Back at a rented cabin 10 miles south, with the blinds drawn and a vintage Sony TC-220 cassette deck humming to life, the investigator pressed play. At first, only static, thin and hissing like distant rain. Then wind. Not the gentle whisper of a winter breeze, but a howling gale, the kind that whips tree limbs into whips and turns snow into shards of glass. Beneath it, voices, urgent, close. A woman, Margaret Loomis, unmistakably shouting over the storm, "Stay on the marked path. Do not deviate, the ice is," a crackle. Then louder, "They're not following the path, we didn't clear that sector." The words sent a chill deeper than the Adirondack cold. According to all official records, the entire lake had been deemed safe for emergency crossing after a routine inspection on February 11. There were no sectors, no uncleared zones. And yet here was Loomis, seconds before everything went wrong, admitting that part of the ice had not been prepared. That someone, or something, had led the group off the approved route. Then came the hum. It began low, almost subsonic, a vibration more felt than heard. It rose slowly, weaving through the wind like a thread of sound pulled taut. Not mechanical, not natural, organic, almost like a chorus of voices singing a single, sustained note through water. The campers' voices fell silent one by one, not screams, not cries for help, just cessation, as if they'd been gently hushed. For 13 seconds only the hum remained. Then, faint but clear, a child's voice, soft, calm, eerily detached, whispered, "It's singing back." The tape ended with a sharp click. The investigator played it again, and again. On the fourth listen, slowing the playback by 20%, another layer emerged beneath the hum, a rhythmic pulsing, steady as a heartbeat, synced to the lake's natural resonance frequency. Experts later confirmed it. The tone matched no known generator, turbine, or atmospheric phenomenon, but it did match the resonant signature of Lake Frostvale's deepest basin, recorded by geological surveys in the 1970s and never publicly released. What made the recording truly unnerving wasn't just what it contained, but what it contradicted. The 1987 incident report claimed radio silence fell at 21:15 due to atmospheric interference. Yet this tape, time-stamped by the recorder's internal counter, verified through forensic calibration, ran until 21:47. And the quality, clean, directional, undistorted, meant the recorder had been placed on the ice, not inside a cabin. Someone had set it down and walked away, or been taken. Most haunting of all was the child's final line, not its singing, not "I hear singing," it's singing back, as if whatever was in the lake had responded to something the children had done, something they'd said or sung or thought, as if they'd been communicating. In the quiet aftermath of the playback, with the cabin's wood stove ticking as it cooled, the investigator stared at the cassette lying on the table like a relic from another world. It wasn't just evidence of a tragedy. It was a message, a warning, and maybe, just maybe, a key. Because if the ice could hold voices for 35 years, then perhaps it could also hold answers, but only if you knew how to listen. The Franklin County Clerk's office smelled of lemon oil and slow decay, a place where time moved in paper trails and dust motes. It was here, in a windowless back room stacked floor to ceiling with cardboard boxes stamped with faded red codes, that the investigator began peeling back the layers of the official story. County records from 1987 were supposed to be straightforward: incident reports, search logs, death certificates, insurance filings. But from the moment they requested the Frostvale file, the inconsistencies began to surface, not as glaring errors, but as quiet erasures, subtle reorderings, the kind of bureaucratic sleight of hand that only reveals itself when you know what should be there. The camp's seasonal operating permit, for example, had been issued in June 1986 for the summer session. Standard procedure. But tucked in the renewal ledger was a second entry, Permit FV 87W, issued November 3, 1986, winter session authorization. That in itself wasn't unusual. Frostvale had run winter retreats before. What was strange was the footnote: extension approved under Section 12C of the NYS Youth Development Pilot Program. A program that, upon cross-referencing with state archives, had been defunded and dissolved in 1983. Yet here it was, active again, quietly, unofficially, just months before 13 children vanished. Then came the insurance documents. 13 life insurance claims, all filed by next of kin in March 1987, all approved within weeks. Standard, except for the cause of death field. Instead of accidental drowning or exposure, each form listed only, presumed deceased per Franklin County Sheriff's Incident Report 870214. No clinical detail. No coroner's notation. Just a reference to a report that itself contained no medical or forensic conclusions. And when the investigator pulled that incident report, digitized but poorly scanned, they found something even more troubling. The original pages covering February 12 had been replaced with typed duplicates. The font didn't match. The paper stock was newer. And a footnote in the digital archive's metadata read, "Document reprocessed for 151988, FOIA compliance." Why would a local sheriff's report need FOIA compliance, reprocessing nearly a year after the fact, especially when no FOIA request had been filed until 1999? But the most damning contradiction lay in the weather data. The official narrative relied heavily on the idea of a blinding blizzard, a sudden, catastrophic ice storm that stranded the group and made rescue impossible. Yet a deep dive into NOAA's archived radar logs from February 12, 1987, told a different story. The Adirondacks had seen light snowfall that day, yes, but at 20:00 hours, a highly localized microburst passed directly over Lake Frostvale. Not a storm front, not a system. A single violent downdraft lasting 17 minutes, generating wind shear and rapid surface cooling over a radius of just 1.2 miles. Enough to flash freeze open water. Enough to create a patch of unnaturally smooth, glassy ice, exactly as Daniel Reeves had described. And crucially, not enough to justify the claim that search conditions were impossible for weeks. In fact, satellite imagery from February 14 shows clear skis over the region. Search helicopters could have flown. Ground teams could have accessed the lake. Yet the official log states that no substantive search was possible until March 3. Even more telling, buried in a supplemental file from the New York State Parks Department was a permit application dated May 1987, 3 months after the disappearances, requesting structural assessment and potential reopening of Camp Frostvale facilities. The application was approved. Maintenance crews were scheduled. The camp, according to paper, was never closed. It was as if the state refused to acknowledge the campers were gone. As if keeping the camp active somehow kept the truth at bay. Each discovery was a thread pulled from a tapestry carefully woven to look seamless. Alone, any one of these anomalies could be dismissed as clerical error or bureaucratic inertia. But together they formed a pattern, a deliberate effort to obscure, to delay, to normalize the unthinkable. Someone had wanted the world to believe this was a tragic accident, a freak storm, a terrible misjudgment. But the paper trail whispered otherwise. It whispered of planning, of cover-up, of a system that moved faster to file paperwork than to find children. and in the quiet hum of the county archives, surrounded by boxes that hadn't been opened in decades, the investigator realized something chilling. The truth hadn't been buried. It had been filed, alphabetically. The Polaroids were found in the last place anyone would think to look, in the rusted drawer of an old first aid cabinet in the camp infirmary, tucked behind a roll of expired gauze and a bottle of iodine long since turned to sludge. They weren't loose. They were bound together with a rubber band so desiccated it crumbled at the slightest touch, revealing 13 square frames, their white borders yellowed but intact, the images beneath protected by time and neglect. At first glance, they looked like ordinary camp photos, young faces, winter gear, the kind of group shots counselors took during orientation. But the moment the investigator laid them out on the cabin table under the soft glow of a battery-powered lantern, the wrongness seeped in like cold through a crack in the wall. Each photo showed one of the missing campers standing alone on the ice of Lake Frostvale. They wore their issued parkas, red for the younger group, navy for the teens, but their hoods were down despite the February cold. Their gloves were off. Their expressions weren't the forced grins of posed snapshots. They were eerily serene, almost meditative, eyes focused just past the camera as if looking at something beyond the photographer. And in each of their hands, held upright like a slate in a schoolroom, was a small wooden board with a number painted in black, 1 through 13. The date scrawled on the back of the first photo, Feb 12, 1987, 1900, sent a jolt through the room. That was after the storm had begun. According to every witness statement, by 18:30 that evening, visibility had dropped to near zero, wind speeds exceeded 50 miles per hour, and the camp was in full emergency lockdown. No one should have been outside, least of all on the lake. Yet here they were, lined up calm, photographed in what appeared to be clear twilight, with no snow falling, no wind distortion in their hair or clothing. The ice behind them was smooth, glassy, reflecting the last amber light of day in a way that matched Daniel Reeves's description and the microburst data from NOAA. But it was the writing on the backs that turned unease into dread. Beneath each date and time in the same neat, looping hand too precise for a child was a phrase, Session 3, Compliance Excellent, not group photo, not safety drill session, and compliance, clinical terms, institutional, the kind used in behavioral logs, not summer camps. The investigator cross-referenced each face with the official roster from 1987. All 13 were accounted for, names matched, ages aligned. But one photo stopped them cold. Number 7, a girl with braided auburn hair and freckles across her nose. On the back, the name Alina Cho, age 12. Except Alina Cho wasn't listed among the missing. Her name didn't appear in any Frostvale records, insurance claims, or family testimonies. And when they ran the name through public archives, they found her, Dr. Arlene Cho's daughter. Arlene, the geologist who'd surveyed the lake in 1988. A daughter who, according to her obituary, died in a car accident in 1985, 2 years before the camp incident. The implications coiled tight in the chest. Either this was a cruel coincidence, a different Alina Cho, a mislabeled photo, or someone had brought a dead child's name into this place. And if that was true, then the photos weren't documentation. They were part of the experiment. Worse still, when the investigator laid the photos in numeric order, a pattern emerged in the background, subtle at first, then undeniable. The position of each camper on the ice formed a spiral, starting at the shore with number 1, winding inward toward the center of the lake with number 13. Not random, not haphazard, a deliberate arrangement. And at the very heart of the spiral, just visible in number 13's photo, was a dark, circular patch in the ice, darker than the surrounding surface, almost like a hole yet frozen over. Smooth, sealed, waiting. The investigator sat back, the lantern flickering, the 13 faces staring up from the table like silent witnesses. These weren't last photos. They were records of a procedure, and the calm in their eyes wasn't peace. It was the stillness of subjects who had been told exactly what to do and had done it without question. The ice hadn't taken them. They had walked onto it willingly, because someone had taught them to trust the song. The meeting place was a bend in the Ausable River, 10 miles north of Lake Placid, where the water ran shallow over smooth stones and the pines grew so thick they choked out the moonlight. Dr. Arlene Cho had been clear on the phone. No recordings, no notes, no names spoken aloud. "They still listen," she'd said, her voice thin as parchment. "Not with ears, with patterns." She arrived just after dusk in a rusted Subaru with no license plates, her silver hair pulled into a tight braid, her hands gloved despite the mild evening. At 78, she moved with the careful economy of someone who'd spent a lifetime avoiding attention. She wouldn't sit, wouldn't come closer than 10 feet. Instead, she stood at the river's edge, staring into the current as if it might carry away the words she was about to speak. "I wasn't supposed to be on that team," she began, voice low but steady. "I was a glaciologist, studied ice core resonance in the Arctic, but in '88 they pulled me into a special assessment for the New York State Geological Survey, classified, required federal clearance I didn't have, but they gave it to me anyway. That should have been my first warning." She described arriving at Lake Frostvale in April 1988, 16 months after the disappearances. The camp was shuttered, the lake still frozen in patches. Her team's official task: evaluate structural integrity of shoreline erosion. But the real work began when a man in a dark suit handed her a sonar rig unlike any she'd seen, designed not to map depth but to detect acoustic cavities within the ice itself. "They called them resonance pockets," she said. "Tiny chambers trapped in the ice sheet, formed under specific pressure and temperature conditions. Normally, they collapse within weeks, but here, they persisted for over a year." Her team found dozens, arranged in concentric rings beneath the lake's surface. Each emitted a faint harmonic frequency when pinged, like tuning forks embedded in the ice. And when they played those frequencies back through hydrophones, something even stranger happened. "The ice didn't just echo," she said, turning now to face the investigator, her eyes sharp with remembered fear. "It responded, not randomly, in sequences, melodic intervals, minor thirds, the same pattern over and over." She paused, swallowed. "It was a song, and it matched the lullaby my daughter used to hum." The investigator didn't react, but inside the pieces clicked. Elena Cho, the Polaroid, the dead girl's name brought back to life on the ice. Arlene's hands trembled slightly as she continued. "I wrote a report, detailed everything, the anomalous ice structure, the acoustic properties, the possibility of preserved sound signatures. I even suggested the voices reported by locals might be real, trapped vibrations replaying under thermal stress." She let out a dry, humorless laugh. 2 days later, a man came to my motel. No badge, no name, just said my report had been reclassified under Project Northlight. He told me to forget I'd ever been to Frostvale, that if I mentioned resonance pockets again, my tenure would vanish, my grants would dry up, and my daughter's memory would be reassessed in public records. Her voice broke on the last word. "They knew about Elena. They knew I'd lost her, and they used it like a leash." She never filed the report, never published, retired early, moved off-grid, but she'd kept her field notes hidden in a false bottom of an old ammunition case buried beneath her woodpile. And in those pages, scribbled in margins and coded shorthand, was a single repeated conclusion: the ice isn't a tomb, it's a medium. They shaped it to hold sound, like a record, like a memory. Before she left, she pressed a folded piece of paper into the investigator's hand, a hand-drawn spectral graph, labeled Frostvale Acoustic Signature, Feb 12, 1987. At the bottom, in her neat script, "This isn't natural. Someone tuned the lake." Then she turned and walked back to her car without another word. The investigator stood alone by the river, the paper fluttering in the damp air, the water whispering over stone. And for the first time, they understood. The children hadn't just vanished into the ice. They'd been placed there, as part of a design, as part of a song that was never meant to end. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under the cabin door while the investigator slept. No stamp, no postmark, just a manila envelope with a single typed line on the front. For your own safety, stop. Inside was a formal notice on Department of Children and Family Services letterhead, dated 3 days prior, citing unsubstantiated historical allegations and potential disruption to community stability in connection with ongoing inquiries into Camp Frostvale. It warned that further unauthorized dissemination of speculative narratives could result in legal action, including possible revocation of professional credentials and trespass enforcement on state-managed land. At the bottom, in handwritten ink that didn't match the typed font, someone had added, "Daniel Reeves is not who he says he is." The threat wasn't overt, but it was precise, the kind of bureaucratic velvet glove that hides an iron fist. It wasn't just intimidation, it was redirection, a signal that the story had grown too loud, too close to something still breathing beneath the surface. Later that afternoon, as the investigator drove back from the county archives, they noticed the black sedan for the second time that week, a late-model Lincoln, windows tinted, plates obscured by mud. It didn't follow closely. It just appeared at intersections, lingered in parking lots, always half a mile behind like a shadow with a schedule. When they pulled into the gravel lot of the Lake Placid Public Library, the sedan passed without stopping. But the passenger window rolled down just enough for a man in a dark overcoat to stare directly at them for 3 full seconds before the car turned onto Route 86 and vanished into the pines. That evening Daniel Reeves called, his voice tight with something sharper than fear. "They came to my cabin," he said. "Not cops, not rangers, 2 men in gray suits, asked if I'd been revising my recollections. Said the state was preparing a final commemoration package and wanted all surviving staff to sign affidavits confirming the storm narrative." He paused, then added, quieter, "One of them knew my mother's maiden name. The other asked if I still dream about the humming." The pressure was escalating, not with violence but with erasure. The goal wasn't to silence them outright. It was to isolate them, discredit them, fold them back into the official story like a page tucked into a closed book. And then the final blow. A short news segment aired on WNYT, Albany's local affiliate. Grainy archival footage of a press conference from March 1987 played, Sheriff Ed Kowalski, flanked by state officials, solemnly announcing the tragic but unavoidable loss of the campers during extreme weather conditions. But the footage had been altered. In the original, Kowalski stumbles over his words, looks off camera and says, "We don't know what happened out there." In the aired version, that line was gone, replaced by a smooth, confident declaration. The evidence confirms a complete and sudden ice collapse. The audio waveform didn't match. The lighting shifted unnaturally between sentences. Someone had doctored the past to reinforce the present. Worse, the broadcast ended with a new voice, a calm, professional woman identified as Dr. Lillian Marsh, a historical trauma specialist from the New York State Office of Mental Health. "After 35 years," she said, "it's important for families and communities to accept closure. Reinterpreting tragedy through speculative lenses, especially involving voices or songs, can re-traumatize survivors and feed harmful folklore." The screen cut to a photo of the Frostvale Memorial plaque, newly cleaned, newly emphasized. The message was clear: this is over. This is settled. You are imagining things. But the investigator knew better. The alteration of the sheriff's statement wasn't just propaganda, it was proof. Proof that the story still mattered. Proof that someone was still tending the lie like a garden, pruning any shoots of truth that dared to rise. And proof that they were afraid, not of ghosts, but of what the ghosts might say if anyone listened long enough. That night, alone in the cabin with the wind rattling the windows, the investigator took the microcassette from February 12 and played it one more time. Not for clues, for resolve. When the child's whisper came, its singing back, they didn't flinch. They leaned closer, because now they understood. The real threat wasn't the men in suits or the doctored footage. It was silence, and they refused to give it another second. The tin box was no bigger than a shoebox, its green enamel chipped and rusted along the seams, buried beneath 3 loose floorboards in cabin 7, the very cabin where, according to camp rosters, the youngest group of campers had slept. The investigator had been drawn to it by a faint scent, wool and cedar, out of place in the damp rot of the abandoned structure. Prying up the boards with a crowbar left behind by looters, they found the box nestled in a bed of dry moss, as if someone had taken care to keep it preserved, insulated from the moisture that had claimed everything else. Inside, carefully folded and layered, were 13 hand-knitted scarves, each one unique, different colors, different patterns, but all made from the same thick, scratchy wool issued to campers that winter, red with white snowflakes, navy with silver stars, forest green with reindeer. They bore the uneven stitches of children learning to knit, but the craftsmanship was surprisingly consistent, as if guided by the same patient hand. And in the hem of each scarf, near the tassel, a small slit had been sewn, nearly invisible unless you knew to look. Inside each slit, rolled tight like a secret, was a slip of paper no wider than a matchstick. The notes were written in pencil, the script unmistakably childish, round letters, uneven pressure, some letters flipped backward, but the content was chillingly uniform. Every slip bore the same 3 lines. We hear the song. We have to stay quiet. The ice keeps us safe from the ones who listen. No names, no dates, just that mantra repeated 13 times in 13 different hands. The investigator spread them out on the cabin's dusty table, the afternoon light cutting through broken window panes, illuminating the tiny imperfections in each child's writing, the smudged E, the looping Y, the way one child dotted every I with a heart. These weren't copies, they were individual affirmations, vows. Then came the realization. The scarves themselves were coded, not with colors alone but with thread count. The investigator, recalling Daniel's journal entry about the song is a lock, began measuring the knit stitches. Each scarf had a different number of rows between pattern repeats. When transcribed into numbers, 13, 7, 22, 5, 19, 12, 8, 14, 3, 21, 9, 16, 1, and cross-referenced with a simple alphanumeric cipher, A equals 1, B equals 2, etc., they spelled M-A-R-G-R-E-T-L-O-M-I-S. The camp director's name, woven into the very fabric the children wore. But the most haunting detail emerged only when the scarves were held up to the fatting light. Embedded in the wool, almost invisible to the naked eye, were fine metallic threads, copper maybe or aluminum, woven in concentric spirals that matched the pattern seen in the Polaroids on the lake ice. When the investigator passed a magnet near one scarf, the threads responded faintly, aligning like iron filings. These weren't just keepsakes. They were transmitters or dampeners, or both. Arlene Cho's words echoed in the silence. They shaped the ice to hold sound. What if they'd shaped the children too? What if the scarves weren't for warmth, but for tuning, for syncing their voices to the frequency of the lake? The investigator sat back, the weight of the box in their lap like a confession. These children hadn't just been led onto the ice. They'd been prepared, trained, knitted into the design, and their final act, the writing of those notes, wasn't fear. It was defiance. A message smuggled out in the only way they could, hidden in plain sight, wrapped in wool, waiting for someone to care enough to look inside. As dusk settled over Camp Frostvale, the wind picked up again, moaning through the cabin walls. And high above, over the frozen expanse of the lake, the ice gave a low, resonant crack, like a voice clearing its throat. The investigator closed the box but didn't latch it. Some secrets, once found, shouldn't be locked away again. The dive was never supposed to happen. Not officially. Not legally. But after the scarves, after the Polaroids, after the doctored footage and the whispered threats, the investigator knew the truth wasn't in archives or affidavits. It was under the ice. And so, on a brittle morning in early April, with the lake still half frozen and the air sharp enough to sting the lungs, they returned to Frostvale with a borrowed dry suit, a military-grade sonar array borrowed from a sympathetic retired Coast Guard diver, and Daniel Reeves standing silent on the shore, his face unreadable. The sonar had already revealed it days earlier, an anomaly 18 feet below the surface near the center of the lake, not a boulder, not a submerged log, a geometric shape circular, 12 feet in diameter with metallic protrusions radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. The signature matched nothing in the state's underwater inventory, but it matched the spiral pattern from the Polaroids, and the knitting codes, and the humming frequency Arlene Cho had recorded. Now suited up and tethered to a safety line held by 2 local divers who'd agreed to help for the families, the investigator stepped onto the remaining ice shelf at the lake's edge and descended through a man-made hole augured that morning. The cold hit like a physical blow, water at 34 degrees seeping into every seam, stealing breath, narrowing vision. But as they sank deeper, the world grew quieter, clearer. Sunlight fractured through the ice above, casting shifting blue halos across the lakebed. And there it was. The platform was made of pressure-treated timber, blackened by decades underwater but still intact, held in place by iron stakes driven deep into the sediment. Bolted to its surface were 13 metal rings, just large enough for a child's wrist. They were corroded, yes, but not broken, not torn free, as if whoever had worn them hadn't struggled, hadn't tried to escape, had simply stayed. The investigator moved slowly, camera mounted on their chest recording everything, gloved fingers brushing silt from the platform's center. Etched into the wood, barely visible beneath algae, was a symbol, a circle with a single vertical line through it, like a zero with a spine. The same symbol that appeared in the margins of Daniel's journal, the same one Arlene Cho had seen on the sonar rig casing in 1988. Then the ice above cracked. Not a distant groan this time, but a sharp, resonant snap directly overhead. The sound traveled through the water like a struck bell, and suddenly, impossibly, their comms unit, silent until now, filled with whispers, overlapping, calm, familiar. "Daniel, you left us the path." It was a boy's voice, young, clear, and it wasn't coming through the radio. It was vibrating through the water itself, through the bones of the investigator's skull. The divers on the surface later swore they heard nothing. But down here in the cathedral of cold and silence, it was undeniable. They didn't panic, they listened. And in the seconds that followed, more voices joined, counting, humming, overlapping in that same harmonic minor third Arlene had described. The song wasn't coming from the lake bed. It was coming from the ice, from the resonance pockets, from the 13 places where the children had stood. The investigators' hands trembled inside their gloves as they reached for the center of the platform. Beneath a loose plank held in place by rusted nails was a small metal box, sealed, waterproof, stamped with the same symbol. They pried it open with a dive knife. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, was a single key, heavy, brass, worn smooth from handling. On its bow, stamped in block letters, Frostvale deep storage. As they surfaced, gasping, the whispers faded, the ice stilled, but the key remained in their grip, cold and real. And for the first time they understood, the platform wasn't a trap, it was a threshold, and the children hadn't been taken. They'd been anchored, willingly or not, to something that was still waiting to be unlocked. The bunker wasn't on any map, not state geological surveys, not USGS topographic charts, not even Cold War-era civil defense blueprints declassified in the 1990s. It revealed itself only because the key fit. Tucked into a steep, pine-choked ravine half a mile east of the lake, behind a tangle of fallen timber and a curtain of thorny wild rose, the entrance was a slab of poured concrete, partially buried under decades of leaf litter and moss. At its center, almost invisible unless you knew to look, was a keyhole, rusted but functional. The investigator turned the brass key with a grinding click that echoed like a bone snapping in the quiet woods. The door swung inward on oiled hinges, releasing a breath of air so still and cold it carried the scent of old paper, ozone, and something faintly metallic, like blood left to dry in a sealed room. Inside, a narrow corridor sloped downward, lit only by the beam of the investigator's headlamp. The walls were smooth, reinforced concrete, painted a dull institutional green, peeling in long strips. At the bottom of the stairs, a single room stretched 30 feet in every direction, empty except for steel shelves lining the walls and a metal desk bolted to the floor. The shelves held nothing but dust and a few scattered file folders, most of them water-damaged or chewed by rodents. But on the desk, centered as if left for a visitor, was a black binder with no title, only a stamped logo in faded silver ink, a circle with a vertical line through it, identical to the one on the submerged platform. Inside, the first page bore a header, Project NORTHLIGHT, U.S. Youth Resilience Initiative Clearance Level Omega. The documents that followed were redacted in long black bars, but enough remained to piece together the truth. Northlight wasn't about survival training or wilderness therapy. It was an offshoot of Cold War-era behavioral research, specifically the study of acoustic imprinting and environmental entrainment in adolescent subjects. The goal: to determine whether prolonged exposure to specific resonant frequencies could induce states of hypercompliance, altered perception, or even shared hallucination. Lake Frostvale had been selected for its unique geology, the deep, still basin capable of sustaining harmonic resonance for weeks, even months. The ice during winter acted as both a conductor and a containment field. One memo, dated January 15, 1987, outlined Phase 3, field integration. It listed 13 subjects' names redacted, but ages 10-16, selected from partner institutions, a euphemism the investigator guessed for group homes, foster programs, and juvenile detention centers where disappearances would raise fewer questions. They were brought to Frostvale under the guise of a winter leadership retreat. But the real purpose was the ice crossing, an orchestrated event designed to test group synchronization under extreme auditory stimuli. At the bottom of the page, a handwritten note in the margin in Margaret Loomis's handwriting: "They're not subjects, they're children, and they're afraid of the song." But the most damning evidence was stamped not on paper, but on the bunker itself. On the far wall, partially obscured by a collapsed shelf, the investigator ran their hand along the concrete and felt it, a series of raised impressions like a mold left behind. Brushing away the dust, they revealed a manufacturer's stamp: U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Structure FV07, completion date, January 12, 1987. January 12, weeks before the camp officially opened for its winter session, weeks before the first camper arrived. This bunker hadn't been built to support a retreat. It had been the command center for an experiment, and the camp was just the cover. The investigator stood in the silence, the beam of their headlamp trembling slightly. Outside, the wind moved through the pines like a sigh. Inside, the air felt heavier, charged with the weight of what had been done here, not in secret exactly, but in plain sight, dressed in parkas and merit badges and the language of care. The concrete floor, the metal desk, the empty shelves, they weren't just evidence of a program. They were the skeleton of a lie that had frozen 13 children in time and kept them singing in the ice for 35 years. And the stamp on the wall, cold and official, proved it hadn't been rogue actors or a lone mad scientist. It had been sanctioned, funded, built to last. As they turned to leave, they noticed something they'd missed before. Scratched into the underside of the desk, nearly worn away, were 13 tally marks. And beneath them, in small, desperate letters, "We tried to stop humming." The story broke not with a press conference or a documentary drop, but with a single email sent at 2:17 a.m. to a dozen journalists, historians, and surviving family members, attaching scanned pages from the Northlight binder, the stamped concrete photo, and the sonar image of the submerged platform. By dawn, it was everywhere. By noon, Frostvale truth was trending. And by the time the New York State Capitol opened its doors that morning, Senator Miriam Cho, Dr. Arlene Cho's granddaughter, was already on the phone with the Senate Ethics Committee, demanding an emergency hearing. What followed wasn't a slow drip of revelation, but a flood. Within 48 hours, 3 former Frostvale staff members came forward. One, a cook named Helen Briggs, now in her late 60s and living in Syracuse, admitted on a local news segment that campers were taken out onto the ice at night for quiet time. A euphemism, she said, for listening exercises. Another, a maintenance man, recalled seeing military-style vehicles with no markings arriving after dark in January 1987, unloading equipment into the woods. And then there was Daniel Reeves, who, for the first time in 35 years, spoke on camera, his voice steady, his eyes dry but burning, as he held up his 1987 journal and said, "They weren't lost. They were left. And someone made sure we'd never look hard enough to find out why." The public response was seismic. Families of the missing, many of whom had spent decades being told to accept the tragedy or stop chasing ghosts, gathered outside the Franklin County Courthouse with photos of their children, scarves in hand, demanding answers. A makeshift memorial grew at the lake's edge, flowers, stuffed animals, handwritten notes tied to tree branches. Local radio played "You Are My Sunshine" on loop for an entire day, a haunting callback to the whisper on the microcassette. And online, acoustic physicists and historians began dissecting the evidence, confirming that the lake's geology could preserve sound under specific conditions, and that the U.S. government had experimented with infrasound and behavioral acoustics during the Cold War. The state, cornered, had no choice but to act. On April 22, exactly 35 years and 10 weeks after the disappearances, the New York State Senate announced a formal inquiry into historical oversight failures at Camp Frostvale. The hearing, scheduled for May, would subpoena surviving officials, declassify all related documents, and most significantly, authorize a full forensic dive of the lake to recover the platform and any biological evidence. But the official response was a masterclass in damage control. The Department of Defense issued a terse statement. Project Northlight was a short-lived, non-operational research concept with no field deployment. Any suggestion of human testing is unfounded. The National Archives quietly released 12 pages of heavily redacted files, just enough to appear transparent, but omitting all references to human subjects, funding sources, or Margaret Loomis's role. And the memorial plaque at the lake, which families had adorned with fresh flowers, was removed overnight by unknown persons, replaced with a generic stone marker reading only, "In memory of those lost to winter, 1987. Yet the ground had shifted. Too many voices had spoken. Too much evidence had surfaced. Even the black SUVs stopped appearing. The threats went silent, because the truth was no longer contained in a cabin, a bunker, or a box of scarves. It was out in the open, refracted through news cycles, shared in community halls, whispered by parents to their children as a warning. And in that public reckoning, something long denied was finally granted: dignity. Not just for the 13 who vanished, but for those who'd spent lifetimes carrying the weight of being told their grief was imagination. As the sun set on the first day of the public outcry, Daniel stood at the edge of Lake Frostvale, watching steam rise from the thawing ice. For the first time in decades, he didn't hear humming. He heard wind, water, birds returning, and beneath it all, the quiet, gathering force of a community refusing to let silence win. The journal had always been Daniel's anchor, a lifeline to a night he couldn't forget, even when he wanted to. But it wasn't until after the bunker was exposed, after the world finally believed him, that he dared to look at it again with new eyes. He'd kept it locked away since handing over the original pages, but now, sitting at his kitchen table beneath the dim yellow glow of a single bare bulb, he opened it once more, not as a witness but as a seeker. For years he'd assumed the smudges, the stray ink blots, the cramped writing in the margins were just the frantic scrawl of a terrified boy. But under ultraviolet light, borrowed from a retired forensics archivist who'd seen too many hidden truths in old paper, a different layer emerged. Faint, almost invisible unless angled just right, were words written in UV-reactive ink, weaving between his own entries like a ghost script. The handwriting was precise, controlled, unmistakably Margaret Loomis. She, written over his journal while he slept. Session 3 begins tonight, one margin note read. They're ready, but I'm not. Another. The song isn't theirs, it's ours, we made it, and now it won't stop. And then, most chillingly, repeated 3 times across different pages, the song is a lock, don't let them hear you hum. Daniel's breath caught. He'd always thought the humming came from the lake, but Margaret knew better. She knew it came from them, from the people who'd built the experiment, who'd tuned the ice, who'd believed they could control a frequency that, once awakened, couldn't be silenced. And she'd been trying to warn him, not just in person that night, but in the only place she knew he'd look again someday, his own journal. As he turned to the final pages, the ones he'd never understood, the UV light revealed something more. Tucked between his last entry and the back cover, almost fused to the paper by time, was a faint graphite sketch. It showed Lake Frostvale from above, but not as a map. As a musical staff, 13 dots, each labeled with a camper's first name, were placed along 5 invisible lines connected by curved beams like notes in a score. And beneath it, in Margaret's hand, they're not missing. They're holding the cord. The realization settled like ice water in his veins. The children hadn't just been subjected to the song, they'd become part of it. Their voices, their presence, their stillness on the ice, they were sustaining a harmonic structure, keeping something contained. That was why they stayed quiet, why they didn't struggle, why their notes said the ice kept them safe. Not from the cold. From the ones who listen, the architects of Northlight, who might return if the song ever broke. Daniel closed the journal slowly, his fingers tracing the worn edge. All this time, he'd believed he'd failed them by leaving, but Margaret had chosen him for a reason. He was the only one who hadn't been on the ice, the only one not woven into the cord, the only one who could carry the truth out and keep it safe until the world was ready to hear it. Now, with the state hearings looming and the lake finally being treated as a crime scene rather than a grave, he understood his role had changed. He wasn't just a survivor. He was the keeper of the silence between the notes, the space that made the song meaningful. And as long as he remembered, as long as he refused to hum, the lock would hold. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, but Daniel didn't flinch. For the first time, the quiet didn't feel like absence. It felt like vigilance. The morning of the thaw ceremony dawned clear and still, the kind of Adirondack spring day that feels like a promise, cold at the edges but warm at the heart. Families arrived before sunrise, some driving through the night from as far as Ohio and Massachusetts, their cars lined up along the old access road like pilgrims returning to sacred ground. They carried paper lanterns, homemade from rice paper and birch twigs, each one inscribed with a name: Myra, Jonah, Elena, Trey, 13 names. 13 lives that had never grown old. No officials came, no politicians. The state had offered a formal memorial service in Albany, but the families had declined. This wasn't about bureaucracy or closure dictated from above. It was about presence, about standing on the shore where their children had last been seen and saying, finally, without fear or apology, "We remember you." Daniel stood apart at first, hands in his coat pockets, watching as the group gathered near the water's edge. He didn't speak, but his presence was acknowledged with nods, with quiet touches on the arm, with eyes that held no blame, only shared sorrow. He'd brought a scarf with him, knitted over the past week in the same rough wool he remembered from camp, dyed a deep forest green. It wasn't one of the originals. It was his own, his offering. As the sun crested the eastern ridge, casting long gold fingers across the lake, a local elder from the Mohawk Nation, a woman whose grandmother had once traded furs with the first settlers in these woods, stepped forward and sang a water song in K-A-N-I-E-N adjective K-E-acute-H-A, her voice low and resonant, rising and falling like the breath of the earth itself. There were no tears, not yet, just stillness, just listening. One by one, the families lit their lanterns and set them adrift on the water. The flames flickered against the dark surface, tiny points of light moving slowly toward the center of the lake, the place where sonar had revealed the platform, where the ice had held its secrets for 35 winters. And as the last lantern floated away, something unexpected happened. The ice, which had been groaning and shifting for weeks as it melted, fell utterly silent. No crack, no hum, no whisper, just the soft lap of water against stone, the rustle of pine needles, the distant call of a loon. For the first time in decades, the lake was quiet, not empty, but at peace. And in that silence, the families understood. The voices weren't gone. They'd been heard, and that was enough. Afterward, as people lingered, sharing coffee from thermoses and stories too long buried, a state representative approached Daniel, not with a statement or a subpoena, but with a single sheet of paper, a proposal to designate the entire Frostvale Basin as a protected historical and ecological memorial site with no future development permitted. The families insisted, the man said quietly. They said if the lake holds memory, it should be honored, not studied, not exploited, just remembered. Daniel nodded. No words were needed. Before he left, he walked to the water's edge, knelt in the wet gravel, and placed his green scarf on the ice where it met the open water. It wouldn't last. The thaw would take it, carry it down into the depths. But for now it lay there, simple, human, a thread of color against the white and blue. He didn't look back as he walked away, not because he was afraid, but because. For the first time he knew they were safe, not in the way the ice had kept them safe, but in the way memory keeps love alive. And that, he finally understood, was the only kind of safety that lasted. Weeks passed. The hearings in Albany dragged on, stacks of redacted documents, aging bureaucrats claiming no recollection, the hollow echo of institutional regret offered without accountability. The state memorial designation for Lake Frostvale was approved, but with caveats: no excavation, no further sonar mapping, out of respect for the site's sanctity. The official story had shifted just enough to absorb the truth without ever fully admitting it. Project Northlight remained a ghost in the archives, acknowledged only in whispers and footnotes. But for the families, for Daniel, for the town that had carried this wound for 35 years, something had changed. The silence had been broken, not with a roar but with a name spoken aloud, a lantern set on the water, a scarf left on the ice. Life resumed its rhythm. Daniel returned to his ranger rounds, though now he sometimes stopped at the lake's edge, not out of guilt but out of habit, a quiet check-in like visiting an old friend. The ice was gone now, melted into spring runoff, the water dark and deep and unbroken. He no longer expected to hear voices, but he listened anyway, not for answers but for the absence of dread. And in that absence he found a kind of peace. Then on a rainy Tuesday in late May, a package arrived at his cabin. No return address, just his name, typed neatly on a brown envelope. Inside was a USB drive and a single sheet of hydrophone data printout from the Great Lakes Acoustic Monitoring Network, a joint NOAA, University of Michigan project tracking underwater sound for climate research. The printout showed a spectrogram captured on May 3, 2022 in the deep basin of Lake Superior near the Wisconsin border. At first glance, it looked like background noise, but circled in red pencil was a narrow band of frequency, 432, 7Hz, pulsing in a repeating sequence of minor thirds. The same harmonic signature recorded at Frostvale, the same song. Attached to the digital file on the drive was a metadata tag, buried in the code like a signature: Northlight. Daniel didn't call the investigator, didn't alert the press. He simply walked to his desk, opened the drawer where he kept his old maps, and spread out a nautical chart of the Great Lakes. With a pencil, he drew a circle around the coordinates from the printout, then another around Lake Frostvale, then hesitantly a third around a place he'd only heard whispered once, in a late-night phone call from a woman in New Mexico, months ago, who'd mentioned a facility near Dulce. He didn't connect the dots with lines, not yet, but he saw the pattern emerging, faint but undeniable, like ice forming beneath still water. Northlight hadn't been a single experiment, it had been a network, and if the song was still playing in Lake Superior, then it hadn't ended. He closed the map, tucked it away, and went outside to split wood. The rain had stopped. The air smelled of wet pine and damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, a loon called once, twice, a sound that could be mistaken for a child's voice if you didn't know better. But Daniel knew better now. He knew the difference between memory and message, between grief and warning. He kept splitting wood, kept listening, and in the quiet rhythm of axe meeting log he prepared, not for closure but for what came next, because the ice had spoken, and the world was wider and deeper than anyone had ever admitted.